Silence in the bullpen wasn't just quiet. It was a physical weight. 30 keyboards stopped clacking at the exact same second. Paige stood completely frozen, a manila folder still extended in her trembling hand. She had just handed the quarterly shipping manifests to the head of the most ruthless syndicate on the East Coast, a man who made city regulators sweat through their tailored suits. Worse, she had just looked dead into his cold, slate-gray eyes and said, "Here you go, honey." The fluorescent lights in the administrative bullpen of Moretti Logistics hummed with the specific, headache-inducing frequency of a dying wasp. Paige Winslow sat at her desk, pressing the heels of her hands into her eyes. It was 3:14 p.m. on a Thursday. Her coffee tasted like battery acid and burnt aluminum, having sat on her desk heater since 8 in the morning. She was running on 3 hours of sleep, half a protein bar, and pure, unfiltered panic. Paige wasn't supposed to be here. She had a degree in graphic design and a portfolio she hadn't opened in 2 years. But life had a funny way of stripping away ambition and replacing it with the brutal mathematics of survival. Her ex-boyfriend, Kevin, a man whose charm was only outweighed by his complete lack of a moral compass, had vanished 6 months ago. He left behind a half-empty apartment, a closet full of cheap cologne, and a joint bank account overdrawn by $30,000. It wasn't a bank loan either. It was the kind of loan that came with late-night phone calls from men with gravelly voices who didn't ask for routing numbers. So Paige worked. She worked the front desk at a gym at dawn, and she sat in the bullpen at Moretti Logistics until dusk. Everyone in the city knew what Moretti Logistics really was. The corporate shell was immaculate. They had a fleet of trucks, a massive warehouse district by the docks, and a pristine glass tower downtown. But you didn't have to look hard to see the seams. The security guards wore suits that cost more than Paige's annual salary, and their jackets always bulged slightly under the left arm. The executive turnover rate was 0. People didn't quit Moretti Logistics. They just quietly retired to Florida, or they disappeared. Gabriel Moretti ran the whole operation. Paige had seen him exactly 4 times in her 8 months at the company. He didn't mingle with the admin pool. He was a phantom of dark wool and sharp angles, usually flanked by men who looked like they chewed glass for breakfast. He was terrifying, not because he yelled, but because he didn't have to. The air in the room simply died when he walked into it. Her desk phone flashed red. An external call. Paige snatched the receiver, trapping it between her shoulder and her ear while her fingers flew across her keyboard, trying to finish formatting the doc reports. "Moretti Logistics, how can I direct your call?" "You're short." The voice on the other end was like sandpaper. It was the collector. Again. Paige's stomach dropped into her cheap, sensible pumps. "I sent the wire transfer yesterday, $400, just like we agreed." "Interest kicked in on the first, sweetheart. You're short." "Please," Paige whispered, keeping her voice low, so Sylvia, the office manager whose desk was 3 feet away, wouldn't hear. Sylvia lived to report people to HR. "I get paid on Friday. I'll make up the difference then. Just give me 24 hours. "That's not how this works." I know, honey. Please, just let me." The heavy oak doors at the end of the bullpen swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sylvia stopped typing mid-sentence. The low murmur of 30 people talking on headsets vanished. Gabriel Moretti stepped into the room. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit his broad shoulders with lethal precision. His dark hair was swept back, a few stray strands falling across his forehead, softening a face that looked carved from granite. His eyes, a chilling, pale gray, swept over the frozen bullpen. Behind him walked Nico, his head of security, a mountain of a man with a scarred jaw and dead eyes. Gabriel didn't look at the junior accountants. He didn't look at Sylvia. He walked straight down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the low pile carpet. He was heading for the filing station. He was heading for Paige's desk. "I have to go!" Paige hissed into the phone. "We aren't done." She slammed the receiver down. Her heart was a frantic bird, battering against her ribs. She scrambled to grab the blue folder on the corner of her desk, the priority doc manifests Sylvia had dumped on her an hour ago. Gabriel stopped in front of her cubicle. Up close he smelled of cedarwood, expensive rain, and absolute authority. He didn't say a word. He just extended one large, scarred hand, expectantly. Paige's brain was misfiring. The stress of the phone call, the lack of sleep, the sheer paralyzing proximity of the city's most dangerous man, it all collided into a disastrous short circuit. She picked up the folder. She handed it to him. And then, her mouth opened, and her exhausted brain finished the sentence it had started on the phone. "Here you go, honey." The word hung in the air. It didn't just hang, it floated, illuminated by invisible neon, twirling for everyone in the room to see. "Honey." Nico stopped dead in his tracks. Sylvia gasped, an actual audible inhalation of horror. Paige felt the blood drain from her face so fast she thought she might pass out. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. It was the sound of a guillotine blade being hoisted up. Gabriel Moretti stared at her. His hand remained outstretched, grasping the edge of the blue folder. He didn't blink. His expression didn't change. He just looked at her, his pale eyes pinning her to the cheap fabric of her office chair. Paige's voice failed. Her throat closed up. Gabriel slowly pulled the folder from her limp fingers. The paper slid with a loud shh in the dead quiet of the room. He didn't yell. He didn't throw the file. He simply tapped the edge of the folder against his other hand, his gaze dropping to the brass nameplate pinned to her cubicle wall. "Paige Winslow, Administrative Assistant." "Thank you, Paige," Gabriel said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone. It was calm. Too calm. It was the kind of calm that precedes a natural disaster. He turned on his heel and walked back up the aisle. Nico lingered for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes drilling into Paige with a mixture of disbelief and pity, before he turned and followed his boss out the double doors. The doors clicked shut. The bullpen exploded into a collective exhale. The noise rushed back in a wave of frantic whispering. Paige sank into her chair. Her legs simply gave out. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to press them flat against her desk. A cold sweat broke out across the back of her neck. "Are you out of your mind?" Sylvia's chair rolled over, crashing into the side of Paige's desk. The older woman's face was flushed, her eyes wide with malicious glee. Sylvia had been trying to find a reason to fire Paige for 3 months, purely because Paige refused to contribute to the mandatory office birthday fund. "It was an accident," Paige whispered, staring blankly at her computer monitor. The screensaver had bounced a pixelated logo from corner to corner. "I was on the phone. My brain just slipped." "You called Mr. Moretti honey." Sylvia leaned in, dropping her voice to a harsh hiss. "A man who allegedly threw a union boss off the Washington Bridge last year. You called him a pet name in front of the entire floor. I know what I did, Sylvia." "Pack your desk," Sylvia said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "Honestly, you'll be lucky if getting fired is the worst thing that happens to you today." Sylvia wasn't wrong. Paige opened her bottom drawer. She didn't have a box, so she just pulled her canvas tote bag from under the desk. She started dropping things into it. A half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, 3 cheap pens, a framed photo of her golden retriever, Buster, who lived with her mom in Ohio because Paige couldn't afford pet rent. Her chest felt tight, bound by iron bands. Fired. She was going to be fired, and if she was fired, she lost her primary income. If she lost her income, she missed the next payment. If she missed the next payment, Kevin's loan sharks wouldn't just call. They would show up. She was zipping up her tote bag when the intercom on Sylvia's desk buzzed. It sounded like a chainsaw in the quiet room. Sylvia practically dove to press the button. "Yes, Mr. Moretti's office." "Send the girl up." It was Nico's voice. Flat, rough, uncompromising. Sylvia released the button and looked at Paige. The smugness was gone. replaced by genuine unease. Even Sylvia knew that being called up to the penthouse wasn't a standard HR procedure. People went to the top floor to get promoted, or they went to the top floor to disappear. "Well," Sylvia said, her voice tight. "Don't keep them waiting." Paige stood up. Her knees felt like water. She didn't take her bag. If she was leaving the building for good, she'd come back for it. If she wasn't coming back, well, she wouldn't need ibuprofen anyway. She walked down the center aisle. She could feel the eyes of 30 co-workers burning into her back. Nobody spoke. Nobody offered a sympathetic smile. In the ecosystem of Moretti Logistics, proximity to a bleeding wound just attracted sharks. She reached the private elevator at the end of the hall. It required a key card, but the doors slid open the moment she stepped onto the mat. They were expecting her. Paige stepped inside. The elevator smelled faintly of the same cedar and rain cologne Gabriel wore. The doors closed, sealing her in. The wood-paneled walls felt like a coffin. There were no buttons. The car simply began to rise, pulling her stomach down toward her shoes. "Just apologize," she told herself frantically. "Say it was a slip of the tongue. Grovel. Cry if you have to. Ask for a severance. No, don't ask for money. Just ask to leave with all your fingers attached." The elevator slowed. A soft chime rang out. The doors slid open. The top floor of Moretti Logistics didn't look like a corporate office. It looked like a museum exhibit curated by a billionaire with a taste for intimidation. The floors were dark, polished mahogany. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline, gray clouds rolling in over the skyscrapers. There were no cubicles here, no humming fluorescent lights, just quiet wealth and heavy shadows. Nico was leaning against the wall near a set of massive double doors. He pushed himself off the wall as Paige stepped out of the elevator. He didn't smile. He just jerked his chin toward the doors. "He's inside." Paige swallowed hard, trying to dislodge the lump in her throat. She walked past the giant security man, her cheap heels clicking loudly on the wood floor. She pushed the heavy door open. Gabriel Moretti's office was vast. A massive desk carved from a single slab of dark wood sat in the center of the room. Behind it, the city loomed through the glass. Gabriel was standing by a wet bar in the corner, pouring amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a short glass. He had taken off his suit jacket and unbuttoned his waistcoat. The holstered weapon strapped to his ribs was clearly visible against the crisp white cotton of his shirt. He didn't look at her as she walked in. "Close the door, Paige." She pushed the door shut. It clicked with a heavy final sound. She stood there 10 feet from his desk, gripping her hands together so tightly her knuckles ached. Gabriel picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and finally turned to look at her. The grey eyes were just as piercing as they had been downstairs, but the anger she expected wasn't there. Instead, there was a heavy, calculating weight to his stare. He walked over to his desk and leaned against the edge of it, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked her up and down, slowly, deliberately. Paige couldn't take the silence anymore. She cracked. "Mr. Moretti, I am so sorry." She blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "I know it was completely inappropriate. I was on the phone right before you walked in, and I was flustered, and my brain just bypassed my mouth. I have immense respect for you and this company. I'm packing my desk right now. You don't even have to officially fire me. I'll just resign, and I promise you will never have to see me again." She stopped, breathing heavily, waiting for the axe to fall. Gabriel watched her for a long moment. He took another sip of his scotch. "Are you finished?" he asked softly. "Yes, sir." "Good." Gabriel set the glass down on his desk. He reached over and picked up the blue folder she had handed him downstairs. He flipped it open. "These manifests are impeccable. Your formatting is highly efficient. In fact, looking into your personnel file, you're the most overqualified and productive assistant on the 5th floor." Paige blinked. That was not what she expected. "Thank you? Which begs the question," Gabriel continued, his voice dropping a register, smoothing out into something dark and velvet. Why is a woman with a design degree and a spotless work record falling asleep at her desk at 2 in the afternoon? Why are there dark circles under your eyes that makeup can't hide? And why, when my head of security pulls the phone logs for the 5th floor, do we find that you've received 14 calls from a burner phone in the last week? Paige's breath hitched. She took a step back, her back hitting the heavy wooden door. He knew. Of course he knew. He was Gabriel Moretti. He probably owned the building the loan sharks operated out of. That's personal, Mr. Moretti. She managed to whisper. Nothing that happens in my building is personal, Paige. Gabriel pushed off the desk and began to walk toward her. His movements were predatory, slow and deliberate. He stopped 2 feet away from her. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Your ex-boyfriend, Kevin? He said the name like it was a piece of rotting meat. He took out a loan of $30,000. He ran. He left your name on the collateral. Tears pricked the corners of Paige's eyes. She hated herself for it. She hated being weak in front of a man who preyed on weakness. Yes, the men holding that paper are associates of mine, Gabriel said quietly. Paige's stomach bottomed out completely. She felt cold, ice cold. Are you going to hurt me? Gabriel's expression finally shifted. The cold, impenetrable mask cracked, revealing a flicker of something raw and intensely angry. But the anger wasn't directed at her. He reached out, his large, warm hand stopping an inch from her face, his fingers hovering near her jaw before he pulled his hand back, curling it into a fist at his side. Do I look like a man who breaks the kneecaps of exhausted secretaries? He asked, his voice rough. I don't know what you look like, Paige said, finding a sudden, stupid spark of defiance. I just know you're the boss, and I owe your people money, and I just embarrassed you in front of your entire staff. You didn't embarrass me, Gabriel said, leaning in slightly. The scent of cedar wrapped around her. You surprised me. People spend their entire lives trying to figure out what to call me. Boss, sir, Mr. Moretti. They say it with fear. You handed me a doc report and called me honey, like I was a husband coming home from a shift at the factory. It was a mistake. Maybe. Gabriel held her gaze. The silence in the room wasn't oppressive anymore. It was charged, thick with an electricity Paige couldn't understand. But the debt isn't a mistake, and neither are the bags under your eyes. He turned away from her, walking back to his desk. He opened a drawer, pulled out a thick envelope, and tossed it onto the polished wood. The debt is handled, Gabriel said, not looking at her. As of 10 minutes ago, Kevin's paper is bought out. You don't owe those men a dime. Paige stared at the envelope. Her brain simply refused to process the words. What? Why? Gabriel looked up, his grey eyes pinning her to the spot once again. The cynical, ruthless mob boss was gone, replaced by a man looking at something he suddenly realized he wanted. Because, Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble, if you're going to call me that again, I prefer you do it when you aren't exhausted. Paige did not remember the elevator ride down. She didn't remember walking past Nico, who had tipped his head in a silent, almost imperceptible nod. She only remembered the heavy weight of the manila envelope in her hands. When the elevator doors parted on the 5th floor, the bullpen was exactly as she had left it. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the keyboards clattered. Sylvia was leaning over the partition, whispering something to the junior logistics coordinator. They both snapped to attention, staring at Paige as she stepped onto the low-pile carpet. They were waiting for the tears. They were waiting for her to grab her canvas tote and do the walk of shame to the service elevator. Paige walked to her desk. She didn't sit down. She opened the envelope Gabriel had tossed on his desk. It wasn't cash. It was a single sheet of heavy stock paper. A promissory note, originally bearing Kevin's sloppy signature and Paige's own desperate co-sign, stamped with a heavy red, "Paid in full." Attached to it was a cashier's check made out to her, for the exact amount she had already bled into the debt over the last 6 months. $4,200. Her legs gave out. She dropped into her cheap office chair, staring at the numbers. It was more money than she had seen in a year. It was rent. It was groceries that didn't come out of a tin can. It was sleep. Well? Sylvia's voice was sharp, cutting through the haze. She was standing by Paige's cubicle, arms crossed. I assume HR will be sending down your termination paperwork by end of day. Paige looked up. For the first time in 8 months, she didn't feel the crushing need to appease the older woman. The perpetual knot of anxiety in her stomach was suddenly, violently gone. Before she could answer, the heavy oak doors at the end of the bullpen swung open again. This time, it wasn't Gabriel. It was Nico. The massive head of security walked down the center aisle with the purposeful stride of a man used to clearing rooms. He didn't look at anyone else. He stopped at Paige's desk. Up close, the scar on his jaw looked pale and jagged. "Miss Winslow," Nico said. His voice was deep, lacking any inflection. Sylvia practically vibrated with vindication. "I can have security escort her out, Nico. There's no need for you to trouble yourself." Nico didn't even blink in Sylvia's direction. He kept his dark eyes on Paige. "Mr. Moretti requested I assist you in moving your things." "Moving them." Sylvia frowned. "To the loading dock." "To the penthouse," Nico corrected flatly. He reached down and picked up Paige's canvas tote bag, hoisting it easily over one massive shoulder. "Mr. Moretti's executive assistant retired last week. He has decided to fill the vacancy internally. Grab your coat, Miss Winslow." The silence in the bullpen was entirely different this time. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of absolute, paralyzed shock. Paige stood up. She grabbed her threadbare wool coat from the back of her chair. She looked at Sylvia, whose mouth was opening and closing like a landed fish, searching for a company policy that covered this exact scenario, and finding none. "I'll see you around, Sylvia," Paige said softly. She followed Nico back down the aisle. Her mind was a static hum. Executive assistant to Gabriel Moretti. The salary alone would be triple what she made now. But she wasn't stupid. She knew this wasn't a promotion based on her pristine doc manifests. It was a cage. A gilded, incredibly well-paying cage. When they reached the top floor, Nico led her past Gabriel's imposing double doors and into an adjoining room. It was an antechamber, beautifully appointed with a massive mahogany desk, 2 monitors, and a sprawling view of the grey city. It smelled like fresh coffee and expensive leather. "Your desk," Nico said, setting her tote on the chair. "HR will send up your new contract in an hour. Mr. Moretti prefers his coffee black, no sugar. He takes his first meetings at 9. He doesn't like being interrupted when the door is closed, unless the building is on fire or someone is dead." "Nico," Paige said, her voice shaking slightly. "Why is he doing this? I embarrassed him." Nico paused. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a brief second, the terrifying mob enforcer looked incredibly tired. "Mr. Moretti lives in a world where everyone wants something from him, or they want to put a bullet in him. Nobody accidentally calls him a pet name. You treated him like a normal man for 3 seconds. He doesn't know how to process that, so he's doing the only thing he knows how to do. Which is what? Owning the problem," Nico said. He turned and walked out, leaving Paige alone in the quiet luxury of her new reality. 2 weeks passed. The first few days, Paige expected the other shoe to drop. She expected Gabriel to demand something unspeakable, or for the loan sharks to magically reappear. She jumped every time the private elevator chimed. But nothing happened. The work was demanding, but straightforward. She managed Gabriel's schedule, filtered his calls, and organized files that contained names of city officials and sums of money that made her mildly nauseous to look at. She learned very quickly what to ignore. Gabriel himself was an enigma. He rarely spoke to her beyond giving direct orders. He was a creature of intense focus, spending hours behind his desk, dealing with men who spoke in low voices and wore suits that cost more than a car. But there were the other things. On Tuesday of her second week, a state-of-the-art espresso machine appeared on her desk. On Thursday, her broken office chair was replaced by a Herman Miller ergonomic seat. When she sneezed twice on a Friday morning, Nico silently placed a box of boutique tissues and a bottle of imported vitamin C on her keyboard. Gabriel was watching her. He didn't hover, but he was always aware of her. It was a rainy Wednesday evening when the boundary finally broke. The clock on her computer read 7:45 p.m. The rest of the building was empty. Paige was finishing a complex routing schedule for a fleet of trucks heading to Chicago. The heavy doors to Gabriel's office opened. He stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his face were drawn tight. "You're still here," Gabriel said. It wasn't a question. "You didn't dismiss me, sir," Paige replied, not looking up from her monitor. "I don't recall asking you to stay until 8 o'clock at night. The Chicago route needs finalizing before the drivers clock in at midnight." She hit save, and finally turned to look at him. "I'm almost done." Gabriel stepped into her office. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the rain slicking the city streets in neon reflections. "Have you eaten?" "I had a granola bar." He let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "A granola bar. You're making 6 figures now, Paige. You can afford actual food. Old habits," she said quietly. It was true. Even with the debt gone and her bank account flush, she still woke up in a panic at 3 a.m., convinced the floor was going to fall out from under her. Poverty left a stain that money couldn't immediately wash out. Gabriel turned away from the window. "Come in here. Bring your coat." Paige hesitated, then saved her work and locked her screen. She grabbed her coat and walked into his office. There was a low coffee table near a leather sofa in the corner. On it sat 2 massive, steaming takeout containers from a high-end Italian restaurant downtown. The smell of garlic, rich tomato sauce, and roasted meats hit Paige's stomach like a physical blow. Her mouth watered instantly. "Sit," Gabriel ordered, taking a seat on the opposite side of the table. She sat. She felt ridiculous, perched on the edge of a $5,000 sofa in her sensible work slacks. Gabriel opened the containers, pushing a plate of veal parmesan and truffle risotto toward her. He handed her a silver fork. "Eat!" Paige didn't argue. She took a bite. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She closed her eyes for a brief second, letting out a soft sigh. When she opened them, Gabriel was watching her, his own fork resting on his plate. The intense, predatory look in his gray eyes was back. "You were drowning," Gabriel said abruptly. Paige swallowed hard, setting her fork down. "Excuse me? When you first walked into this office, you looked like you were drowning." He picked up his scotch glass from the table, swirling the amber liquid. "Kevin, tell me about him." Paige tensed. "Why, you bought his debt. It's over." "Because I want to know what kind of man leaves a woman to face the wolves alone." Gabriel's voice was devoid of emotion, but the grip on his glass was white-knuckled. Paige looked down at her plate. "He wasn't a monster, Mr. Moretti. He was just a coward. He liked nice things. He liked the idea of being a big shot. He took a loan to invest in some real estate scam, and when it went bust, he panicked. He told me he was going to the store for cigarettes. He never came back. And you stayed. I had a lease. I had a life. I didn't have anywhere else to go." She looked up, meeting his gaze. She was tired of being afraid of him. "I survived. I'm surviving. You shouldn't have to just survive," Gabriel said quietly. "That's easy for you to say. You run the city." Gabriel laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "I run a machine, Paige, a machine that grinds up everyone who touches it. The men I deal with would cut my throat for a 3% bump in profit. There is no loyalty. There is only leverage." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Then a girl with bags under her eyes hands me a piece of paper and calls me honey. Not because she wants leverage, because she was just a human being making a human mistake. Paige's heart hammered against her ribs. The space between them felt incredibly small. The rain battered against the glass, enclosing them in a private, dim world. "I'm not a mistake, Gabriel," she said. She didn't realize she used his first name until it left her mouth. Gabriel's eyes darkened. He reached across the small table. His fingers brushed against her wrist, warm and calloused. He didn't grab her. He just rested his hand against her skin, feeling her pulse jump. "No," Gabriel murmured, his thumb stroking the fragile bone of her wrist. "You're the only real thing in this entire building." The illusion of safety shattered on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks later. Paige was at her desk, sorting through the morning mail. The routine had become comfortable. She drank the expensive espresso. She managed the chaos. She ate lunch with Gabriel in his office every day, a silent agreement they hadn't discussed but rigidly adhered to. At 10:15 a.m., the private elevator chimed. Paige glanced up, expecting Nico returning from a perimeter check. Instead, the doors slid open to reveal a man she had never seen before. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, wearing a camel hair coat that hung loosely over a gaunt frame. His face was deeply lined, and his eyes were a pale, watery blue. Flanking him were 2 men who didn't bother hiding the bulges under their jackets. They weren't Moretti security. They looked rougher, hungrier. The older man didn't look at Paige. He walked straight toward Gabriel's doors. Paige stood up quickly, moving to block the path. "Excuse me, sir, you can't go in there. Mr. Moretti is in a meeting." The older man finally stopped. He looked at Paige the way someone might look at a smudge on a window. "Move aside, sweetheart," the man said. His voice was a raspy wheeze. "I need your name," Paige insisted, her heart beginning a familiar, frantic rhythm. She reached for the panic button mounted under the edge of her desk. "And you need an appointment." One of the men behind him stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed Paige by the upper arm and shoved her hard. Paige stumbled backward, her hip crashing into the edge of her heavy mahogany desk. A sharp spike of pain shot down her leg. She gasped, grabbing the edge of the wood to keep from falling. Before the man could push the double doors open, they were ripped open from the inside. Gabriel stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows. The expression on his face made Paige's blood run cold. It was the face of the man who ran the East Coast Syndicate. It was death, perfectly tailored. Nico was right behind him, his hand already resting inside his jacket. Gabriel didn't look at the older man. His eyes went instantly to Paige, clinging to her desk, her hand rubbing her bruised arm. The temperature in the room plummeted. The silence was deafening. "Arthur," Gabriel said. His voice was a whisper, but it carried perfectly across the room. "Why is your dog putting his hands on my assistant?" The older man, Arthur, offered a thin, placating smile. "Gabriel, the girl was in the way. We need to talk about the docks down in South Philly. Your new tariffs are choking my people." Gabriel stepped out of his office. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. He didn't walk toward Arthur. He walked toward the man who had shoved Paige. The man bristled, standing his ground, puffing his chest out slightly. It was the last mistake he ever made with 2 working arms. Gabriel didn't yell. He didn't telegraph the movement. His hand shot out, grabbing the man by the lapels of his cheap suit, spinning him around and slamming him face first into the reinforced glass of the elevator bay. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The man crumpled, groaning. Before he could hit the floor, Gabriel grabbed his right arm, twisted it violently behind the man's back, and drove his knee into the elbow joint. A sickening crack echoed through the antechamber. The man screamed, a high, reedy sound of absolute agony, and collapsed onto the polished wood floor. Arthur's other bodyguard reached into his coat. Nico drew his weapon in a blur of motion, pressing the muzzle directly against the bodyguard's temple. "Try it," Nico suggested softly. Arthur's face drained of color. He took a step back, raising his hands. "Gabriel, have you lost your mind? Over a secretary?" Gabriel stood over the groaning man on the floor. He slowly straightened his cuffs, his chest heaving slightly. He turned his dead grey eyes to Arthur. "You have 5 minutes to drag this piece of trash out of my building," Gabriel said, his voice entirely devoid of human warmth. "If I see you on this floor again without an invitation, Arthur, I won't break your arm. I'll take your head. The South Philly tariffs just doubled. Get out." Arthur didn't argue. He signaled frantically to his remaining bodyguard, who dragged the sobbing man toward the elevator. The doors closed, taking the violence with them. The silence rushed back in. Nico holstered his weapon and quietly retreated into Gabriel's office, pulling one of the heavy doors shut behind him to give them privacy. Gabriel stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, staring at the floor. Then he turned to Paige. The monster vanished. His shoulders dropped. He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping right in front of her. He reached out, his hands hovering over her arms, terrified to touch her. "Did he hurt you?" Gabriel asked. His voice was strained, thick with panic. "No." Paige breathed, her eyes wide, staring at the man who had just broken someone in half without a second thought. "I hit the desk. I'm fine." Gabriel closed his eyes. He let out a long, shuddering breath. When he opened them again, he didn't pull away. He stepped closer, crowding her against the desk. He reached up, cupping her face in his large, warm hands. His thumbs gently stroked her cheekbones. "I'm sorry," Gabriel whispered fiercely, staring into her eyes. "I'm so sorry you had to see that. But nobody touches you, Paige. Nobody. You are mine to protect." Paige looked up at him. She saw the blood on his knuckles. She saw the absolute, terrifying devotion in his eyes. She wasn't an employee anymore. She hadn't been since the day she handed him a folder and made a mistake. She took a breath, reached up, and placed her hands over his. "I know," she said. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in Paige's chest. Gabriel's hands were still on her face. His thumbs, slightly rough with calluses, traced the line of her cheekbones. She could smell the metallic tang of blood from his bruised knuckles, mixing with his expensive cedar cologne. It was a contradiction that perfectly encapsulated the man standing in front of her. Violence and luxury, brutality and absolute care. "I have to clean up," Gabriel murmured, his voice thick and rough. He didn't move away. He just stared into her eyes, searching for the revulsion he clearly expected to find. Paige didn't pull back. She didn't flinch. 6 months ago, if she had seen a man break someone's arm with zero hesitation, she would have called the police. She would have run screaming. But the world had ground her down since then. She had learned the hard way that the police didn't answer calls about predatory loans, and the world only protected people who could afford the armor. Gabriel was armor, forged in the dark, heavy and terrifying, but impenetrable. "Your knuckles are bleeding," Paige said quietly. Gabriel looked down at his hands as if he had forgotten they belonged to him. The skin over his right knuckles was split, welling with dark red drops. He dropped his hands from her face, suddenly looking incredibly weary. "Nico will drive you home," Gabriel said, stepping back, creating a physical distance that felt unnaturally cold. "Take the rest of the week. Full pay. Don't argue with me on this, Paige. I need to know you're not in this building while I clean up the mess the South Philly faction just tracked onto my floor." Paige wanted to argue. She wanted to stay. But the look in Gabriel's grey eyes was absolute steel. He was back in syndicate mode. He was calculating variables, managing threats. She nodded once. "Okay." Nico escorted her down to the underground parking garage. They bypassed the 5th floor completely. Paige didn't have to see Sylvia or the junior accountants. She didn't have to pretend everything was normal. Nico's vehicle was a massive, matte black SUV, with windows so dark they looked like polished obsidian. The interior smelled like new leather and gun oil. Nico drove with a terrifying, smooth efficiency, navigating the slick city streets without a word. When they pulled up to her apartment building, a crumbling brick structure wedged between a 24-hour laundromat and a discount liquor store, Nico put the SUV in park but kept the engine running. "He's going to post a man on your fire escape, and one in the lobby," Nico said flatly, staring straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. "Don't be alarmed if you see them. They work for me. You won't hear them, and they won't bother you. They're just making sure nobody knocks on your door who shouldn't." Paige stared at the side of Nico's scarred face. "Is Gabriel in trouble?" Nico let out a dry, raspy chuckle. "Miss Winslow, Mr. Moretti isn't in trouble. He is the trouble. The South Philly crew just signed their own eviction notice. Get some rest." For 3 days, Paige stayed in her tiny apartment. The silence was deafening. She watched the rain streak against her single window. She made cheap tea. She paced the worn floorboards. True to Nico's word, she caught glimpses of the shadows. A man in a dark, heavy coat reading a newspaper in the lobby at 2 in the morning when she went down to check her mail. Another silhouette standing near the alleyway when she looked out her window. They were ghosts. Lethal, silent ghosts keeping the monsters at bay. She realized something terrifying on the 3rd night, sitting on her lumpy sofa in the dark. She missed him. She missed the intense, suffocating gravity of Gabriel's presence. She missed the quiet lunches. She missed the way he looked at her like she was the only puzzle he couldn't violently solve. On Monday morning, she put on her best sensible slacks, a crisp white blouse, and her cheap black pumps. She tied her hair back. She walked out of her apartment building, ignoring the man in the lobby who gave her a short, respectful nod and hailed a cab. When she stepped off the private elevator onto the penthouse floor, the antechamber was empty. The shattered glass of the elevator bay had been completely replaced. The floor was spotless. It was as if the violence had never happened. Paige set her canvas tote down on her heavy mahogany desk. She booted up her computer. She walked over to the espresso machine, made a double shot, black, no sugar, and walked toward Gabriel's heavy oak doors. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open. Gabriel was behind his desk, a phone pressed to his ear, a massive stack of ledgers open in front of him. He looked exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were bruised and heavy. He looked up as she walked in. He froze. The conversation on the other end of the phone continued, a tinny voice buzzing in the quiet room. But Gabriel had clearly stopped listening. Paige walked over to his desk and set the espresso down directly over a spreadsheet tracking offshore shipping containers. "I'll have to call you back," Gabriel said abruptly, cutting the person on the other end off mid-sentence. He dropped the receiver onto the base. He stared at the small ceramic cup, then up at her. "I told you to take the week. I took 3 days. I was bored." Paige crossed her arms over her chest. "And you look like you haven't slept since Thursday." "I haven't," Gabriel admitted, his voice rough with fatigue. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, rubbing a hand over his face. The South Philly issue required restructuring. Paige didn't ask what restructuring meant. She knew it meant funerals. She knew it meant blood on the docks. "Well," Paige said, keeping her voice perfectly level, grounded in the reality of the room. "You have the meeting with the Port Authority at 11. You have 20 minutes to drink that coffee and put a tie on." Gabriel dropped his hand. He looked at her. Really looked at her. The exhaustion in his eyes shifted, replaced by a slow, burning intensity that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. "You came back," he stated. "The pay is too good to quit." Paige lied smoothly. Gabriel's mouth curved into a faint, dangerous smile. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. It changed his entire face, making him look less like a kingpin and more like a man who had just won a bet against the devil. "Get your notepad, Paige," Gabriel said softly. "We have work to do." The new normal settled over the penthouse floor like a heavy, velvet blanket. The boundary lines had been permanently redrawn. Nico no longer treated her as a civilian liability. He treated her as a fixed point in Gabriel's orbit. The security detail on her apartment building vanished, replaced by Nico simply driving her home every evening. But the past has a funny way of refusing to stay buried. It rots, and it stinks, and eventually it floats to the surface. It was a Tuesday night in late November. The temperature had dropped, bringing a biting, bitter wind off the harbor. Nico had dropped her off an hour ago. Paige was in her tiny kitchen, boiling water for pasta, wearing an oversized grey sweater and thick socks. The buzzer on her intercom screamed. It was a harsh, jarring sound. Paige jumped, nearly knocking the pot of boiling water off the stove. She frowned. She wasn't expecting any packages. Nico always texted if he had to come back. She walked over to the peeling intercom panel on the wall and pressed the button. "Hello?" Static hissed back at her. Then a voice. "Paige, it's me. Please, you gotta let me in." The blood in Paige's veins turned to ice. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 8 months, a voice that belonged to a man who had left her drowning in $30,000 of debt. Kevin. Her finger hovered over the button. Panic, hot and suffocating, spiked in her chest. How did he find her? Why was he here? "Paige, please!" The tinny voice begged through the static. "It's freezing. I just need to talk. I know I messed up. I know it. Just give me 5 minutes. Anger sliced through the panic. It was a cold, sharp rage. She remembered the nights she had spent crying on the kitchen floor, terrified of every knock at the door. She remembered the collector's sandpaper voice. She pressed the button. "Go to hell, Kevin. They're going to kill me, Paige." His voice cracked, rising in pitch. It sounded pathetic. "The guys who held my paper, they found me in Scranton. They said the debt got bought out by the Moretti family. They said you work for the boss now. You have to talk to him. You have to tell him to let me go." Paige stared at the intercom. Kevin didn't know Gabriel had forgiven the debt. He thought the syndicate had bought it just to hunt him down, and he was trying to use her as a human shield. Again. She didn't press the button. She backed away from the wall. A heavy pounding started on her apartment door. Paige spun around. He wasn't downstairs. He was in the hallway. He had buzzed another apartment to get into the building and used the intercom just to confirm she was home. "Paige, open the door!" Kevin yelled, slamming his fist against the cheap wood. The door rattled in its frame. "I know you're in there. Look, you owe me. We were together for 3 years. "I don't owe you anything!" Paige shouted back, grabbing her phone from the kitchen counter. Her hands were shaking. She unlocked the screen and opened her contacts. She didn't dial 911. She dialed the number labeled Nico. Before the call could even connect, the pounding on her door stopped abruptly. It wasn't a slow cessation. It was instant. 1 second the wood was vibrating. The next, dead silence. Paige held her breath, the phone pressed tight to her ear. Nico's voicemail picked up. She hung up. She crept toward the door, her stockinged feet completely silent on the worn floorboards. She pressed her eye to the scratched brass peephole. The hallway was dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb. Kevin was standing there. But he wasn't looking at her door anymore. He was frozen, his back pressed against the peeling wallpaper of the opposite wall. His face was entirely drained of color. He looked exactly as she remembered him, handsome in a weak, cheap way, wearing a leather jacket that was too thin for the weather. But right now, he looked like a terrified rat caught in a spotlight. Standing in front of him, blocking the hallway entirely, was Gabriel. Gabriel wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. He wore a heavy black wool overcoat, the collar turned up against the cold. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting in his coat pockets. He looked completely relaxed. He looked like an apex predator observing a wounded rabbit. Paige couldn't hear what Gabriel was saying. The walls were thin, but Gabriel's voice was too low, a dark rumble that didn't carry through the wood. Kevin started shaking his head frantically. He raised his hands in surrender, his mouth moving in rapid, desperate apologies. Gabriel took 1 step forward, just one. Kevin flinched violently, covering his face with his arms. Gabriel didn't touch him. He just pulled his right hand out of his pocket and pointed down the hallway toward the stairwell. A simple, silent command. Kevin didn't hesitate. He scrambled away from the wall, nearly tripping over his own feet, and bolted down the hall. The heavy fire door to the stairwell slammed shut behind him. Gabriel stood in the empty hallway for a moment. Then he turned and looked directly at the peephole. He knew exactly where she was. Paige unlocked the deadbolt. She pulled the door open. The freezing air from the hallway rushed into her warm apartment. Gabriel stood on her threshold, bringing the scent of cold rain and danger with him. "Get your coat," Gabriel said quietly. "What did you say to him?" Paige asked, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear of Gabriel, but from the massive adrenaline dump of the last 5 minutes. "I told him that if he ever spoke your name again, if he ever stepped foot in this city again, I would make sure they never found enough of him to fill a shoebox." Gabriel's grey eyes were utterly devoid of mercy. "Get your coat, Paige. You're not staying here tonight." "Where am I going?" "My house." Paige looked at him. She looked at the man who had bought her life, rearranged her reality, and just banished the ghost of her past with a whisper. She didn't argue. She walked to the closet, pulled down her threadbare coat, and stepped out into the hallway. Gabriel's home wasn't a penthouse. It wasn't a downtown condo. It was a massive, sprawling estate on the edge of the city, hidden behind high stone walls and wrought-iron gates. The driveway wound through ancient, skeletal oak trees before opening up to a stone mansion that looked like a fortress. The interior was stark. It was beautiful, filled with dark wood, heavy stone, and muted colors, but it felt empty. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a bunker designed by a billionaire. Gabriel led her into a massive library. A fire was already roaring in the hearth, casting flickering orange light across the thousands of leather-bound books. He helped her off with her coat, his hands lingering briefly on her shoulders before he turned away to pour 2 glasses of scotch from a crystal decanter on a side table. He handed her a glass. His fingers brushed against hers. The contact was electric, sharp and undeniable. Paige took a sip. The liquor burned a hot trail down her throat, settling her frayed nerves. She sat down on one of the heavy leather armchairs near the fire. She tucked her knees up to her chest, pulling her oversized sweater down over her legs. Gabriel didn't sit. He stood near the fireplace, staring into the flames. The shadows played across the sharp angles of his face. He looked incredibly isolated. "He shouldn't have been able to get to your door," Gabriel said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was laced with a dark, simmering anger directed entirely at himself. "Nico pulled the detail too soon. That was a failure. It won't happen again." "It's fine, Gabriel. You were there. I was there because I was coming to check on you. By chance. If I had been 10 minutes later, he might have put his hands on you." Gabriel turned to look at her, the firelight reflecting in his slate-grey eyes. "You don't understand the world you're brushing up against, Paige. You think you do, but you don't." Paige lowered her glass. "I understand enough. I understand you." "No, you don't." Gabriel walked over to a heavy oak desk in the corner of the library. He unlocked the top drawer and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. He walked back and tossed it into Paige's lap. It landed with a heavy thud. "What is this?" she asked. "An out," Gabriel said flatly. "It's a new identity, a passport, a social security number, and a bank account routed through a shell corporation in Switzerland, containing $2 million. It's clean money, untraceable." Paige stared at the envelope. Her heart plummeted into her stomach. It felt like a physical blow. "You're firing me." "I'm saving you." Gabriel stepped closer, towering over her chair. The cold distance was back in his eyes, but she could see the effort it took to keep it there. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked near his ear. "Kevin showing up tonight proved it. Proximity to me is a death sentence. The South Philly crew is quiet now, but there will be others. There is always someone else trying to take the crown. If they figure out you matter to me, they won't use you as leverage. They'll use you as a message. Paige's grip on her Scotch glass tightened. So you're paying me to disappear? I'm giving you the life you deserve. A life without looking over your shoulder. A life where you don't have to watch men get broken in half in an elevator bay. You can go anywhere. Open a design studio. Buy a house with a yard for your dog. You never have to see this city or me ever again. Gabriel turned away, staring back into the fire. He braced his hands on the heavy stone mantel. His knuckles were white. Take it, Paige. Leave tomorrow. Paige looked down at the envelope. $2 million. Complete freedom. A reset button on her entire existence. It was everything she had prayed for when she was crying in the dark 6 months ago. She picked the envelope up. It felt heavy. It felt like a coffin. She stood up from the armchair. She walked over to the fireplace, standing right next to Gabriel. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the flames, his posture rigid. Paige held the thick envelope out over the roaring fire. Gabriel's head snapped toward her. His eyes went wide. "What are you doing?" "I'm making a choice," Paige said. She let go. The envelope dropped into the flames. The fire instantly caught the edges of the thick paper, curling it, turning the forged passport and the Swiss bank details to ash. The fire flared bright yellow for a few seconds, consuming the millions of dollars of freedom before settling back into a steady orange glow. Gabriel stared at the burning paper, utterly stunned. He looked back at Paige. The impenetrable mask of the syndicate boss was completely shattered. He looked entirely human. He looked terrified. "Are you insane?" he breathed. "Do you know what you just threw away?" "I threw away a lonely life in a city I don't care about," Paige said, her voice steady. She didn't look away from him. She grounded herself in the reality of the room, the smell of wood smoke and scotch, the dangerous, beautiful man standing inches from her. "I don't want Safe, Gabriel. Safe left me 30 grand in debt with a man who ran away at the first sign of trouble. Safe is a lie." Gabriel slowly turned his body towards her. The space between them evaporated. "Paige, if you stay, you are in. You are mine. The violence, the paranoia, the blood, it becomes yours. I won't ever let you walk away after tonight. If you try to run, I will hunt you down and drag you back here." "I know," Paige whispered. "You'll never have a normal life. Normal is overrated." She reached up, placing her hand flat against his chest. She could feel the heavy, frantic thud of his heart through the expensive fabric of his shirt. It was the only thing betraying his calm exterior. Gabriel let out a ragged breath. He reached up, his hands sliding into her hair, gripping the back of her neck with a fierce, possessive strength. He tilted her head back, his grey eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation, any lingering fear. He found none. Paige smiled. A small, cynical, completely fearless smile. She looked at the man who commanded armies, the man who terrified the city, the man who had bought her debts and broken his own rules just to keep her near. "I'm not going anywhere," Paige said softly, her voice dropping into a register that was meant entirely for him. "Honey," Gabriel groaned, a low, desperate sound in the back of his throat. He crushed his mouth down onto hers. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision. It was fire and ash and absolute possession. Paige kissed him back, wrapping her arms around his neck, anchoring herself to the only real thing in a world built on lies. The debt was gone. The old life was dead. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Well, that escalated perfectly. Paige threw away a $2 million escape hatch just to stay in the fire with Gabriel. What did you think of her final choice? Was she incredibly brave, or did she just make the most dangerous mistake of her life by fully committing to the Mafia kingpin? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing your theories on their chaotic dynamic. If you loved this deep, emotional, slow-burn romance, please smash that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story.